unlock your deep squat potential. Have you ever noticed why some people's squats look more like this and others like this? They look similar at first glance, but if you look closely, they are not the same. Let's call the first squat squat number 1 and the second one squat number 2. Each of us will have a resting squat that resembles more one of these images. Yet we are all told to train our mobility the same way. In this video, I will explain to you why there is no point in training for squat number 1 when your body is more suited for squat number 2. It is something people don't really mention when talking about squat training, but it's extremely important because it will shape what your mobility program will look like if you want to unlock the deepest of squats. I will first break down how squat works. If we define the squat in the simplest of ways, we could say it is a lower body movement that consists mainly of bilateral knee flexion and extension. This means going down to the ground while bending both of your knees and then coming back up while straightening them. So, going down and decreasing the angle of our knees is what we call knee flexion, and then coming back up and straightening our knees is what we call knee extension. Sounds simple, doesn't it? Well, it gets a little bit more complicated than that. When trying to lower down, your body could just bend the knees and isolate the movement with no implication of other joints, like you do on a wall squat. The thing is, if you do this with no assistance of a wall, like on a free squat, there would be so much weight on your trunk that your center of gravity would be displaced backwards, making you fall to the ground. As your body doesn't want that to happen, it automatically makes adjustments in other joints to maintain balance. How much movement we create in each of these joints will make our squat look one way or the other, and this is where it gets interesting. One adjustment that can be made is movement in the spine. When lacking flexibility in other areas, people will round their backs to maintain balance. Flexing our spine will lead to a tilt in our pelvis, a movement commonly known as bat wink. This would be normal lumbar positioning, while in this picture, the flexion of the lumbar spine will lead to our pelvis tucking in. This is what we know as bat wink. This is problematic because, at least on weighted squats, deloaded movement in the intervertebral joints will potentially lead to long-term damage to the intervertebral discs. That is because the forward pressure of the vertebrae will push the contents of the intervertebral discs backwards, having the potential of causing bulges or herniations. Our goal when considering the role of the spine during the squat should be to achieve a deep squat with a solid neutral back, since it will generate virtually no strain on our spine joints. That being said, when training unloaded mobility, rounding of the back shouldn't worry you much. Another possible strategy to maintain balance is placing your arms in front of you. This is what we call shoulder flexion. It is a safer strategy since it doesn't put any real strain on our joints compared to movement in the spine. By placing our arms this way, we are placing more weight in front of us, thus displacing our center of gravity forwards. It is a great training tool for mobility drills, however, it is impossible to perform during most weighted squat variations due to our hands having to hold a barbell. That is, unless you have a passion for the zombie squat, but I'm guessing most people watching aren't looking forward to performing this drill. So here come the important movements. When our body wants to lower to a squat, it will first try to push forward onto the ankles, a movement we call dorsiflexion. Why? Because it is the smallest joint available, meaning it's the most energy efficient movement. Our bodies are lazy, following the principle of least effort. If a task can be achieved in a less demanding way, it will be performed as such. Once the maximum dorsiflexion range is achieved, our body will try to sink in as low as possible into the hips, what we call hip flexion. Think of it like your thighs trying to get as close as possible to your belly. Once these two adjustments have been made, the full squat will be achieved. These adjustments will create a ratio in which some individuals will use more ankle dorsiflexion while others will use more hip flexion, giving us two different types of squats: ankle and hip dominant squats. If we analyze the different angles in each squat, as you can see, the difference is quite substantial. The ankle dominant squat uses a way bigger angle in the ankles. Let's suppose this is around 30 degrees compared to this individual where she's using around 20 degrees. But then when it gets to the hip joint, this individual maybe 110 degrees compared to the second individual, which is using more around the 130 degrees mark. As you can see, the final result, the full squat, is the same. The objective is the same, to maintain balance and not fall backwards, but the tools each body will have to achieve this will be different. Let's talk more about ankle dorsiflexion. An ankle dominant squat will tend to look like this. Now, it is common knowledge that great ankle flexibility is one of the most important pieces to build our deep squat. The thing with dorsiflexion is it is a very limited movement, consisting of around 25 degrees in most individuals. This means that our potential for increasing our baseline range of motion is also very limited. I've seen people try it all to improve their dorsiflexion. Weighted stretches, both static and dynamic, banded mobilizations, squat holds, anything you can imagine. Yet range of motion barely increases a few degrees over time. I'm not saying you can't improve your ankle mobility, but it's not the most optimal way of improving your squat depth. And this is where hip mobility comes into play, the most underrated way to improve your squat. Let's be real, a hip dominant squat is not good looking, but it's the most realistic deep squat most of us non-elite athletes with gifted ankle genetics will achieve. Why is that? While your ankle joint is compromised of a very tight space where structures jam against each other every time you try to push the range of motion limits, your hip joint is a ball and socket joint designed for big movements and consisting of around 100 degrees of flexion. Now, remember what I said before? We were talking about 20 degrees of movement for the ankles compared to 100 degrees of hip flexion. Big difference, huh? When comparing, the potential of improvement for your hip mobility is huge compared to your ankle. That is why I advocate for focusing on your hip flexion for achieving a great deep squat. Another reason we should focus on our hip mobility is because our ankle mobility is amendable during the squats thanks to a cheat code known as weightlifting shoes. These shoes are specifically designed for Olympic weightlifting with two main objectives. One, provide a stable surface to generate power from the ground, and two, raise our heel to artificially compensate for our lack of ankle dorsiflexion. Of course, it is not a permanent solution, since the moment we take them off, our ankle mobility will be as terrible as always, but it will help us train our squat mobility in a safe manner that makes us stand upright and not allowing movement in the spine. It will also help us sink deep in the squat and develop the hip flexion we were talking about, and even probably develop our ankle mobility a little bit. Based in all this information, I'm gonna show you an effective strategy to finally achieve the deep squat we've been long hoping for. First, get some weightlifting shoes with as much of a heel raise as possible. This will allow you to train the squat safe and purposefully and not be limited by your ankles. 2. Squat as often as possible in your gym sessions. Prioritize time spent in the squat, since over time it will slowly increase your mobility. 3. When working on stretches, it is fine to train ankle dorsiflexion, but spend a greater amount of time working on your hip flexion, with exercises such as this standing hamstring stretch, as performed in the image with your hips elevating onto a surface, knee to chest stretch, and deep squat holds. And last tip, last part of this strategy, work long term. You are trying to compensate a lifetime of not having a deep squat with some training sessions during the week. Be realistic and patient and keep adding minutes spent on the squat and you will improve over time. Training this way will finally unlock your potential for a deep squat. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this video was helpful and I will leave you linked here some other videos. See you next time.